All right, good morning to my friends joining us via recording. Today is April 27th. We are reviewing for exam number 4. Exam number 4 is available right now, going through Wednesday of this week, the 29th of this week. So exam number 4 covers lesson number 12 and lesson number 13. We are hopefully coming up with a few topics that we'd like to cover. My friends in the chat have been very quiet this morning. Okay, so the types of structures in the eyeball, we definitely wanted to talk about those. Okay, so a request for reflexes and tracts. So what I can do with those reflexes is classifying them, because that I think is the big thing with those reflexes, classifying them, figuring out the kind of predictions we need to make with those tracts, definitely. Types of structures in the eyeball. What other topics? That's 3 topics. That's definitely not going to take us 2 hours. Or we can just, talk to each other, have all kinds of fun. So cranial nerves for special senses probably is what you're mentioning, which cranial nerves help us out with the special senses. Okay, we can definitely talk through that again. Yep, cranial nerves, special senses. Okay, process of hearing. Okay, and those types of equilibrium. Okay, this is a better list that'll fill up our time. We'll see how we do with this stuff, and then some of the eye disorder stuff if we have time. Certainly. I'm going to make sure to hit the reflexes and tracts today because that's the lesson 12 stuff, and we'll get through as much as we can for the lesson 13 stuff, and then depending on what we don't get through today, I'll definitely plan to cover that tomorrow to make sure we've covered it all. Let's make sure we remember, when is the lesson number 13 homework assignment due? When do we have to have lesson number 13 done by? Yeah, Kathleen chimed in. That's Tuesday night. I had toyed with having it due Sunday like usual, but I don't need you guys to take the exam today. You got to take it by Wednesday at the very latest. My standing rule, that was the case with the lab exam, and I'm going to say it here with the lecture exams too. Please do not wait until Wednesday night to try to take the exam, because if something goes wrong, I can't guarantee that I can get you on track to take it in time. So please try to take it. Yeah, Eileen mentioned she might try to get it over with today. That's perfect. Please try to plan to take it no later than tomorrow night, just to make sure, like I said, if something happens to go wrong, if your internet dies, if something like that happens, you have time to get in touch with me. So technically due by Wednesday night, but let's try to get it done today or tomorrow, just to be on the safe side. So let me go to my pictures from lesson number 12. We talked about reflexes first. So let me go ahead and, let's hope we can get through this exam without issues, Eileen. I feel ya. Man, internet these days is really being stretched, right? Okay. So somebody help me out. We are in the lesson number 12 packet. We're looking at the first reflex that I mentioned for you guys to know, which is the patellar reflex. Okay, so Eileen's saying page 5. Sounds like page 5. Perfect. Okay. So we'll go through and we'll talk about the specific reflexes that I had you guys learn. But before we go through and talk about specific reflexes, what I want to do with you guys is remind you of all the ways that we need to be able to classify reflexes. So there's 3 characteristics that I told you guys we always need to make sure that we know with each of our reflexes. So the first thing we need to make sure we know with our reflexes should be the easiest thing for us to know. That's whether our reflex is considered a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex. The first thing we need to know about all of our reflexes, are they spinal or are they cranial? Can somebody help me out in the chat? How would you know from a picture like this one, we're looking at the patellar reflex here, how would I be able to tell from this picture if it's a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex? Does anyone remember how we could tell from a picture which kind of reflex we're looking at in the body? Yeah, so if it's going to the spinal cord, if we see something related to the spinal cord, the spine, something like that, it's going to spinal reflex. If you see something that looks funky, meaning it doesn't look like a spinal cord, just like this, then we're looking at a cranial reflex. So a reminder for us here that when we talk about a spinal reflex, in a spinal reflex, we do integration. There's a Unit 3 word, integration, so processing in the spinal cord. Processing in the spinal cord. So if you're looking at a picture and you see a spinal cord somewhere in that picture, we see those horns that we're learning the neurons, what they all do in them. If I see the gray matter horns and I see the white matter on the outside, I know I'm looking at a cross section of the spinal, and this is a spinal reflex. I'm doing processing in the spinal cord. If I see anything else, we're looking at a cranial reflex. So in a cranial reflex, my integration is in the brain stem. So an anatomy reminder for us of what the brain stem was. The brain stem had 3 parts to it. The bottommost part was called the medulla, or the medulla oblongata. That's its full name. Then we had the pons, and we had the midbrain. I promise I will not ask you on the exam if a cranial reflex is occurring in the medulla or the pons or the midbrain. Like, I'm not going to give you a picture and make you figure out which of these 3 parts it's occurring in. But if you look and you don't see that spinal cord, like we talked about, then we're looking at a cranial reflex. You're going to see stuff going on in one of these 3 regions, even if we can't tell which one it is. That's totally fine. Okay, so, excuse me. First thing we have to know with reflexes, is it a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex? And we can tell that simply by looking at whether or not there's a spinal cord. You see one, spinal reflex. You don't see one, not a spinal reflex. Second thing that we need to know is if our reflex is monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Help me out in the chat. What does it mean if a reflex, what does this information refer to? Let's just start there. What does monosynaptic versus polysynaptic mean? Let's start there. Okay, perfect. So we're seeing our 2 definitions, which is great because that's going to help us when we're trying to figure out monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. The first definition of it comes down to this part right here, the synaptic part. When we talk about this synaptic word here, it means synapse. Synapse. A synapse is a place where neurons meet. Place where neurons meet. So if I have a reflex that I call a monosynaptic reflex, I have one place where neurons meet. If I have what's called a polysynaptic reflex, I have multiple places where neurons meet. So the first way I could define monosynaptic versus polysynaptic is how many places do I see neurons meeting? If I just see one place where they meet up with each other, that's monosynaptic. If I see multiple places where they meet, that's polysynaptic. Now, the other way that I can define monosynaptic versus polysynaptic has to do with the number of neurons that are in that reflex. So a monosynaptic reflex has one place where neurons meet. If I'm in a monosynaptic reflex arc, there's one place for neurons to meet, which means I only have 2 neurons total. There's only 2 neurons. And I'll give it away for us here on our patellar reflex. Notice here how we've got our sensory neuron right here. And our sensory neuron meets right here with our motor neuron right here. There's just one place where two neurons touch each other. I don't have another synapse, another location where they meet. This is an example of a monosynaptic reflex. There's one synapse right here. Or if we go based on our number of neurons that I see in the picture, I see only two neurons. There's only two here. There's the sensory one in blue and the motor one here in black. Most of the reflexes in our body, though, are polysynaptic reflexes. Yeah, so Mary Beth chimed in. If I only have two neurons, let's go back to the idea here. If I only have two neurons, that means I don't have space for an interneuron. I don't have space for my processing neuron. It just goes straight from sensory into motor. Absolutely. So monosynaptic reflexes don't have interneurons because they only have a sensory neuron and a motor neuron. They got one synapse, one place for things to reach, or to meet, excuse me. With polysynaptic reflexes, we are going to have at least three neurons, because we're going to include that neuron that we said we were missing. So we didn't have an interneuron when we were talking about a monosynaptic reflex. In a typical polysynaptic reflex, you will definitely have an interneuron. And if I have an interneuron, that means I have multiple places where neurons are going to meet with each other. The sensory neuron is going to talk to the interneuron. The interneuron is going to talk to the motor neuron. Now I have more than one synapse. So polysynaptic reflexes, we're going to have an interneuron. We're going to have at least three neurons because I have sensory, motor, and interneuron. I also am going to have at least two of those synapses, places where the neurons are meeting. The last way that I need to classify each of my reflexes is if they are ipsilateral or contralateral. Help me out in the chat. What do these words mean? Ipsilateral and contralateral. What do those words mean for me? Yeah, so some of us are breaking down the names, absolutely. First one that we talked about is ipsi. Ipsi, well, both of these, here, let's back up. Both of these have the word lateral in them. Lateral was a lab word, meaning toward the side. So we have two kinds of ways that things can be on the side. They can be ipsilateral and they can be contralateral. So the best and easiest way for us to figure out what's going on with reflexes like this is to define their beginning parts here. So this beginning part, ipsi, means same side, same side. So something that's ipsilateral means that information comes in. So here's my sensory information coming in, and then it leaves on the same side of the spinal cord. An ipsilateral reflex, information comes in the same side that it goes out. That's ipsilateral. Contra means opposite. Opposite. Usually what happens with a contralateral reflex is not only do I send out information to the opposite side of the spinal cord, I also send out information to the same side. So what you'll usually see with a contralateral reflex is that I end up having information going out both sides of the spinal cord. But we hone in on this contra part because the big thing, as we'll see on a reflex coming up here, is the fact that there's information that goes out the opposite side. That's what makes it different from an ipsilateral reflex. I saw a question. Let me pull it up really fast. Does this mean the same side for brain as well, or a cranial one's always contralateral? So the thing with reflexes, Ashley, to address your question, is reflexes never involve the cerebrum itself. It only goes as high as the brain stem. So when we talk about the way that you consciously control your body's movements, we would say that the opposite side of your brain controls the side of your body, right? But we don't get as high as the cerebrum because at that point, it's not a reflex anymore. The big thing about reflexes is it doesn't go to the cerebrum. So when we're in the brainstem, we could be ipsilateral or contralateral in the brainstem. We could be either of them, but we would never involve the cerebrum itself, the actual brain, if you will. We only go as high as the brainstem. Yeah, so good question about that. Brainstem reflexes, cranial reflexes can be either ipsilateral or contralateral. Okay, so we've said this for most of our reflexes, or most of the stuff going on in this picture here. Let's remind ourselves. This is the patellar reflex. Remember, I told you guys jokingly, this is what we use to kick our doctor. So when we're kicking our doctor, is this an example of a spinal reflex or a cranial reflex? What does my picture tell me? Yep, this is definitely a spinal reflex. There's that spinal cord right there. So information doesn't even have to go to your brainstem. We just do it right there in the spinal cord. Is this one monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Mono or poly? Yeah, this is the one when we were first talking about it in class, right? You guys were like, it literally says it. Yeah, it does. So this is a monosynaptic reflex. Remember, that means there is one synapse, one place where neurons meet, or in other words, what we talked about, no interneuron in this reflex arc. And my final way to classify it is this ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsi or contra? What do we think? Yep, this is another one that's ipsilateral. So sensory information comes in from, I guess, let me see, it looks like this is probably the right leg. So sensory information comes in from the right leg, goes back out to the right leg. It would be really dicey if you kicked your doctor with your left leg when they tapped on your right leg, right? So this is definitely an ipsilateral reflex. So the one other thing we need to know about our reflexes is we need to know what's called the stimulus. The stimulus. And think about the stimulus as what makes this reflex happen. What makes this reflex happen? When we're talking about the patellar reflex, the one where, like I said, you kick your doctor, this is a reflex that's caused by stretching. So in particular, they tap on the patellar tendon right here in your knee. When they tap on that tendon, it actually pulls on some of our quadriceps muscles here in the front, stretches them out, and that stretch is what we detect and we send back to the spinal cord, which causes us to contract the muscle to make sure it's not too stretched out because of that tapping. So the one other thing you need to know about the patellar reflex, besides these classifications that we did, is what its stimulus is. For the patellar reflex, it's stretching of that patellar tendon. Yeah, Eileen mentioned it's amazing how fast this happens. This is probably the fastest reflex in the body. Part of why it's so fast is right here, because it is a monosynaptic reflex, meaning there's no processing at all that's involved. You go straight from detecting that your muscle's getting stretched into contracting that muscle to make sure that it doesn't get too stretched out. So monosynaptic reflex is very quick. There's our first one. All right, next reflex. We need to go through and classify this the way that we did before. So let's start with our classifications here. Is this reflex called the flexor withdrawal reflex? Is this reflex a cranial reflex or a spinal reflex? Can we tell from our picture? What kind of reflex is this? Yes, we're chiming in. This one is definitely another spinal reflex. Again, we can tell because check out my nice spinal cord cross section right here. So definitely a spinal reflex. Can we tell from our picture here, is this monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Okay, we're agreeing this one is a polysynaptic reflex. There are two ways that I can tell that this is polysynaptic. Can you guys tell me in the chat, what are the two ways I can tell that this one is a polysynaptic reflex? Two things I can see in this picture that out. Yeah, a couple of us have identified the middle thing right here. Check out my nice little interneuron right here. We have an interneuron inside the spinal cord. So that means that I am a polysynaptic reflex. The other way I can tell, let me switch colors here. Polysynaptic means many meeting places, like Eileen mentioned for us. So here's a meeting place right here. I guess red was a bad color. Here's another meeting place right here. I have more than one meeting place for my neurons. That makes it polysynaptic. I'm always going to have more than one meeting place if I have an interneuron included. So we are a spinal reflex. We are a polysynaptic reflex. And our last one, are we ipsilateral or contralateral? Ipsilateral or contralateral? Yeah, so several of us are chiming in for me. This is an ipsilateral reflex. Ipsilateral reflex. The reason I know is because here comes that sensory information into the back part of the spinal cord. We synapse with our interneuron, and our interneuron sends out a message on the same side of the spinal cord. Again, think about this. This is the flexor withdrawal reflex. This is the one that you use if you touch something that's really hot. You don't want to touch something really hot with your right hand and then move your left hand away. That's not going to help you not get burned. So this is another example of an ipsilateral reflex where the side that detected the stimulus is the side that responds. Yeah, so Eileen asked, the stimulus on this one is pain. Yeah, so we should probably clarify on this one here, the stimulus. Technically, we could say that stimulus is pain, yes. Does anyone remember when we talked about pain, what is a pain sensation? Does anyone remember how we talked about it? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in. When we detect pain, what we're actually detecting is too much of some other sensation. So in the case here, when, yes, we could absolutely say the flexor withdrawal reflex, the stimulus is pain. Specifically, it's the way that Kathleen put it here, or Akila put it for us too, is it's too much or it's excessive heat. Because you can touch something that's warm or something even that's hot and not withdraw your hand from it. But if you get too hot, if it starts to damage your, in this case, your fingers, for example, we're going to register that no longer just as heat or being warm. We're going to register that as pain. So probably the best way to think about it, yes, this would be registering as pain. Specifically, what our image shows us is that we started as a heat sensation, but then it got too much heat, which is what damaged us and caused us pain. So yeah, we would probably say the stimulus on this one would be pain. If you guys remember from, I think on the homework assignment, the way that I had you guys kind of sort it out or talk about it was saying that it was pain caused by too much heat. So short answer is yes, it's a pain problem. Specifically though, remember that any pain sensations, it can be too much heat. It can be too much, we can do too much stretching. We can do too much pressure. We can do too much cold, hot and cold, too much vibration, etc. Any of those general senses, if I get too many of them, that registers as pain. So pain is just too much. So Kylie asked, anything damaging, like touching something that is sharp or something else? Yeah, so this reflex, in the particular way that we talked about it with heat. It would be possible, yes, that something like touching something really sharp could do this as well, definitely. Or like I think about like when I get a paper cut and my reflex is to pull my hand away from where I'm getting a paper cut, right? So this one is pain, definitely. I would say this one probably isn't going to be pain caused by too much pressure, because we're actually going to look at one that's like that. But yeah, in general, it could be more than just heat pain. But heat pain is probably the main one that we think of when we think of the flexor withdrawal reflex, definitely. Eileen asked if we talked about, I presume it's about pain in lesson 13. Possibly, as far as the general senses. I know we talked about general senses and special senses. We mentioned the difference between them in lesson 13. So it's possible that we talked more about this pain sensation in lesson 13 as well. Definitely, that it's too much of those general senses. Yeah. Here's another reflex for us that we do have another stimulus that we could call pain. Although in this case, so here I'll put that on our list here just to begin with. Stimulus is probably still considered pain. In this case, with the crossed extensor reflex, the pain, especially from the picture we're looking at here, is too much pressure. Let's see if I can fit that word. Barely. Too much pressure. Pressure is what you feel when you're holding something heavy, like a bowling ball, for example, how it pulls your hand down. But it's also what you feel if you're stepping on a nail. Or what's the example that I gave you guys in office hours? I think I even gave it to you in a lesson too. What's the other thing we talked about that's just as painful as a nail? Yeah, oh, those Legos, man. Stepping on Legos, no good. So I like to jokingly call the crossed extensor reflex the Lego reflex. So if you're stepping on a Lego, especially those little 4 pieces, man, those are the death of me. You step on a little tiny Lego, or you step on a nail, to be fair, that's painful too. Stepping on something that's going to cause too much pressure on this area of your foot, that's going to cause the crossed extensor reflex. When we talk about the crossed extensor reflex, let's describe it. So, crossed extensor reflex, cranial or spinal reflex. What can we tell from our picture here? Cranial or spinal reflex. Yep, this is another example of a spinal reflex. Absolutely. We got a spinal cord going on, right? So I see a spinal cord, it's a spinal reflex. When I look at this reflex, monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Yes, lots of us chiming in. This is definitely polysynaptic. Definitely polysynaptic. This is the most polysynaptic that we've seen too. So check it out. Here is this green one over here. So with my little green arrow here, this is my sensory neuron. My sensory neuron comes in and actually branches. Check out all of these branches here. It actually has a bunch of different axon terminals that go to these really hard to see, but present here, all of these little interneurons. There's 3 little yellow interneurons there in the middle. It synapses with 3 different interneurons to process what's going on. And then those interneurons synapse with multiple motor neurons that I can see here going out to both sides. This is absolutely a polysynaptic reflex. We have way more than 2 neurons going on inside this one. We have way more than just 1 synapse. So definitely a polysynaptic reflex here. And the last thing we were saying with our reflexes is this ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral or contralateral. Yeah, this is my first example and the only example we did in class together that was contralateral. Contralateral. The way I can tell is here's the side that sensory information came in. Here's the side I stepped on the Lego with. And I definitely had a response on the Lego side, but I also had a response on the non-Lego side. Remember, we talked about this. The only worse thing than stepping on a Lego is probably stepping on a Lego and then landing on it with gluteus maximus, right? That would be even worse. So we have to send out directions not only to tell the foot that stepped on the Lego to pull up, but also to tell the other foot, plant down, I need you to catch me so I don't fall down. So this is an example of a contralateral reflex. Yeah, like Monsters, Inc. Yeah, they had some issues with their crossed extensor reflex when he's bouncing all over the room, for sure. This is a contralateral reflex. The way that we defined it technically is that information went out the opposite side that I can see here. But also you can consider if I respond with both sides of my body, I would call that a contralateral reflex. So this one's contralateral, both sides are responding to helping you not fall down on the ground and land on Legos and all kinds of stuff. It's polysynaptic because there are tons of neurons involved in this reflex. It's definitely a spinal reflex because there's that spinal cord. And like we started with, this is another one that has a stimulus of pain. So we've got too much of this pressure sensation, too much pressure that we're putting on our foot where we're trying to stand. We're going to respond with this crossed extensor reflex. Yeah, Kylie's saying that's her every afternoon with the Shopkins. Yes, my daughter really loves to play with little tiny pandas. So we have little tiny pandas that are pretty bad on the floor too. So anything little that you can step on, man, we're grateful we have that crossed extensor reflex to not step all the way down and step onto that. Yeah, Lincoln Log's a little bit more forgiving, that's for sure. Yeah, so things that are rounded, not quite so bad. All right, one last reflex that we did together in our packet was the blinking reflex. Remember, the blinking reflex is what makes you blink. We decided during our office hours that this was us putting on makeup, right? In the very few times that you guys put on makeup these days, right? Man, I'm gonna, full disclosure here, I'm really excited for when office hours are done so I can stop putting on makeup. I'm just gonna be real. So when I'm done putting on makeup, which is next Monday, that's gonna be good times for me. So if that makeup brush goes into the eye and touches the front part of the eye, hey, here we go. Here's a lesson 13 review. What's this front clear part of the eyeball called? What's this area right here on your eyeball, the very front? Yeah, this is the cornea right here. So when we talk about the blinking reflex, let's make some notes for ourselves here. The stimulus on this reflex is touch sensations, but specifically touch sensations of the cornea. So on the cornea, touch sensations on the cornea. That's what's going to trigger the blinking reflex. So, and if you think about it, where the only part of your body that can blink is your eye, right? So if something touches your cornea, that's going to trigger this blinking reflex. All right, let's talk through our classifications here. Is this an example of a cranial or spinal reflex? Can we tell from this one, cranial or spinal? Yeah, so a bunch of us are chiming in. This is the one example of a cranial reflex that we did together. Like I mentioned, the easiest way to tell it's a cranial reflex. We may not know what this is, and it's totally fine if you don't know what this is. You just know it's not the spinal cord, right? This doesn't have that gray matter and white matter. We're somewhere in the brainstem, somewhere that looks real funky in the brainstem. So this is a cranial reflex. It's not a spinal reflex. So we know that much. We know that it's a cranial reflex. Okay, second thing that we need to classify with it, polysynaptic or monosynaptic? Is this monosynaptic or polysynaptic? Can we tell? Yeah, this is going to be another one that's polysynaptic. Polysynaptic. This time I didn't color code it as nice for us as some of them do for me. But see how I've got an arrow showing me that one of them is sending information this direction. And then as somebody pointed out for me here, we've also got an interneuron here in the middle. And then we've got another neuron that's spitting out with information that's going this direction and going up here. So this one is polysynaptic. The ways we can tell that interneuron that I see inside here, and also there's two places where neurons meet with each other here in the brainstem. Okay, cranial reflex, because this isn't the spinal cord. Polysynaptic, because there's a little interneuron inside here. And our last way that we classified was ipsilateral or contralateral. Ipsilateral or contralateral. Yeah, so this one we're feeling a little less confident on it, but it is correct that this is an ipsilateral reflex. Ipsilateral reflex, because I see my information going in on this side of the brainstem. The interneuron processes it and it goes back out on this side of the brainstem. So we're going out on the same side as we're going in. That makes this an ipsilateral reflex. The other thing to consider too is if something is touching your right eye, it does you no good to leave the right eye open and to close the left eye, right? We have to make sure this eye gets closed. So this is an ipsilateral reflex. We're going to push that makeup brush or that piece of dust or whatever it is out of the eye. Kylie asked, does that mean both eyes blink or one? Technically, the reflex by itself, the reflex part of it, just makes one eye blink. It is possible that both of your eyes would blink in response to, for example, if dust blows into your eyes, usually you'd close both of them, but that's not strictly through this blinking reflex. That's through some other ways as well. We would say this one is ipsilateral because both of the sensory and the motor neuron go in or out the same side of the spinal cord. I know I got a couple of questions while we were talking about stuff, asking specifically about pictures or what this will look like on the exam. On the exam, I am not going to give you the pictures of these reflexes. There's just 4 reflexes that I'm asking you to know this stuff on, to memorize this stuff for. So I believe in you guys. You can memorize your classifications for these 4 that we talked about. What I am going to do for you is on the exam, I'm going to give you a picture of a reflex that you haven't seen before. So imagine what it was like when for the first time you saw this reflex. That's what it's going to be like on the exam. So I'm going to give you a reflex you've never seen before, and the way that we just worked through each of these reflexes, that's the way you're going to work through it. So you're going to look to see, do I see a spinal cord or do I not see a spinal cord? Okay, that's cranial or spinal. Do I see just 2 neurons or do I see more than 2 neurons? There's monosynaptic and polysynaptic. Is my information all on one side or is it on both sides? So we went through and we've talked through these examples multiple times to go through the process that I want you to use on the exam. I promise it's not going to be any harder than the way that we've classified our reflexes here. So like I always told you guys in person, right? Don't lose your head. You see a picture of a new reflex that you've never seen before. Look at that reflex and just start processing it the way that we just talked about the reflexes here. So go through your list, cranial or spinal. Is there an interneuron or not an interneuron? Which sides does it go in and out? If you just think through it logically like that, I promise you can answer those questions about the new reflex that I'm giving you. Kylie asked a question, if we got stuff in both eyes, would it still be ipsilateral? Yeah, I mean, I think both eyes have the blinking reflex stuff. So we mentioned this before. This blinking reflex actually goes through cranial nerves. So it goes through cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve, and cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve. So these nerves are both, we have them going to both of our sides of our head, to both eyes. So yeah, we could trip both of our reflexes at the same time. Absolutely. Just like you theoretically could trip both of your crossed extensor reflexes when we step on Legos with both feet. And then you're just really screwed, right? Like there's no saving gluteus maximus. You will be sitting on Legos. So all of these reflexes that we're looking at, we could definitely trip them on either side of the body. You can touch something hot with a right hand or a left hand, and you're still going to have the ability to respond for both of those. All right. What other reflex questions do we have? Or we can have our little dance party. If you're feeling good, you can send me, for my friends who haven't been to many office hours, we do spontaneous dance parties. So send me an emoji if you're feeling pretty good, or send me a question if you still have a question. I'm going to draw us our daily penguin since I got some space over here. But please, if you have a question, type it up for me. I want to make sure we hit our questions before we move on to tracks. Here comes that daily penguin. Hey, we will make today's penguin a girl. Girl penguin today. She gets little hair bows. We spend way too much time doing things like this, right? Actually, I think we spend not nearly enough having dance parties and drawing penguins and all that kind of stuff. We got to stay sane somehow, right? So, all right. So I'm seeing a lot of fun emojis here. We're having a fist bump. I like it. Yeah, we got lots of fun stuff going on. So what I will say is, if you had a question that you weren't comfortable in putting in the chat here, I totally get it. Please feel free to reach out to me via email. I'd be happy to answer it for you. Yeah, I know. I miss going to class with you guys too. It's been sad, right? I was realizing it's been like, I think I was doing the math. It's been like 8 weeks, 7 or 8 weeks, if you can believe that. Like, that was the last time we were all together. So, or at least that's the last time I posted an announcement for a week of class that we were going to be together for. So it's been a long time. So props to you guys for being so awesome and sticking with it and making it this far. Like, I'm really proud of you guys for sticking with it. Any news on when on-site classes are coming back? No. I'll be fully honest with you guys that there is talk about being online in some capacity in the fall. So just a heads up, that is something that I think the plan technically is still that we are on site, but they're advising us as faculty to mentally and academically prepare for the possibility of being online in the fall too, which, yes, I agree with your sentiments, Mary Lou. OMG. Oh my goodness, yes, OMG. So that's what I've heard, but as you guys know, TCC is not particularly fast in making decisions, so we may not know for a little while. But if you want my honest answer, I'm trying to psychologically prepare myself for being online in the fall with my 3-year-old at home, with my newborn at home. So if that gives you any indication of when things are going back to normal, hopefully by the spring, that's the goal. But hopefully we're all wrong. But yeah, I've heard that too, that fall might be worse, which is not exciting, definitely. So yeah, PJs for life or leggings for life. I am loving the leggings life, put it that way. That it's real nice. I usually wear dresses because that's really comfortable with the baby bump. But when I'm just lounging around the house, man, like, maternity leggings are my friend. Like, I call them my teaching pants, my maternity teaching pants. And I just never wear them anymore. So it's really nice. That's the one benefit, right? The one silver lining in this going online thing, right, is that we all get to wear whatever we want and nobody judges us. So yeah, your entire pregnancy living in leggings. Yep, no, I feel it. Yeah. Okay, so that's reflexes. The other big thing from lesson 12 that we wanted to talk about was those tracts. So let's talk a little bit about tracts. I'll mention for you guys that all of the reflex stuff we were talking about is happening inside the gray horns here. Here, let's do some quick review here. We have, let me get out my marker here. We have 3 horns in the spinal cord that were responsible for knowing neurons in. I guess one of those horns is missing. Let me draw the missing little horn right here. This missing little horn that I just drew on right here. Does anyone remember the name of this missing little horn that I just drew here? Who lives, I'll give it away, on the side? Yep, there's my lateral gray horn. So this particular picture doesn't show the lateral gray horn, but that's where it'd be found. This one here that goes almost all the way to this surface of the spinal cord back here, what's the one that lives in the back and touches the back side of the spinal cord? Yeah, here's my dorsal horn here in the back. And then up here in the front, we are looking at the ventral horn. Exactly. Okay, so here's our wink, wink, nudge, nudge reminder that there are 3 horns in the spinal cord. I'm going to clear away all my scribbles here. This one back here, oop, my writing went away. This one back here is that dorsal horn. The dorsal horn, as a reminder for you, is where my interneurons live, where my interneurons, my processing neurons live. And we saw this in our reflex arcs. Sensory information came in here in the back. It's synapsed with an interneuron. If we had an interneuron, remember, if we're polysynaptic, we have an interneuron. That interneuron lived somewhere back here, and then it synapsed with a motor neuron that lived here. So my motor neurons live in the ventral gray horn. Now, to be more accurate and to be more specific, these are what we call somatic motor neurons. Does anyone remember what those somatic motor neurons control, or the ones that are here in the ventral horn? Where do they make things happen in the body? What do they regulate? These ones here. Yeah, the ones on the front side. The ones on the front side are skeletal muscles. Skeletal muscles. So when we're talking reflex arcs, for the most part, we're really talking about skeletal muscles making things happen. That little lateral gray horn that I added here, that lateral gray horn actually controls my other types of muscle tissue. So my motor neurons that go to things like smooth muscle or cardiac muscle, those live out here in the lateral horn, the one that's missing. So that's the very beginning of lesson number 12. Don't forget about those guys. If we have more questions about those types of neurons, bring it to office hours tomorrow. We can talk about it a little bit more. What we said we wanted to talk about today were the tracts. When we talk about tracts in the spinal cord, remember that there are 2 kinds of tracts. Over here on the left, I am seeing my motor tracts. They're highlighted where they're located. And over here on the right, I'm seeing my sensory tracts. Now, remember, we said this is a lot like if you, I guess they call them the ink blot test, right? Where you put ink on 2 sides of the paper, you squeeze it together, and then fold it out in a fan. So what I mean by that is, while the left side shows me everything in red, I also have all that red over here on the right side too. So all the places where you see red on one side, there would be red on the other. All the places where you see blue on the other side, there would be blue on the other as well. So this is why when we were talking about the spinal cord in lab, I told you if there's ever any pin that's in white matter anywhere, we're calling it a tract. Or the lab word that we use, tracts, we called them funiculi. Same thing. So everywhere in the spinal cord, we've got these tracts. Tracts can be classified, because we're big on classifications this chapter. Tracts can be classified as an ascending tract or a descending tract. Ascending and descending are synonyms. When we're talking about ascending tracts or descending tracts, which of those would be considered motor tracts? Who remembers? Is ascending or descending a motor tract? Yeah, motor tracts are my descending motor tracts. Descending, as a reminder here, a definition reminder for us, means it starts in the brain or a brain structure. Brain, that's not going to fit, structure. So this could be things like the brain stem, things like the cerebellum. It starts in the brain or the brain stem, and it ends, cannot type, ends with muscles, ends with muscles. It's a motor tract. So my goal is always some kind of movement, skeletal muscle movement, smooth muscle movement. It's a descending tract, so it starts somewhere up high and then literally goes down, descends down. Descending tracts, motor tracts, which means that my ascending tracts are sensory tracts. Sensory tracts. When I talk about sensory tracts, these are going to be the types of tracts that start in the body somewhere. It could be the skin, it could be an organ, it could be somewhere random in the body. It starts in the body and it ends in the brain or brain structure. Brain structure. So again, that could be the cerebellum, that could be the brain stem. It's somewhere that is above, literally. So you detect something down low and we send it up into the brain or the brain stem. Ascending tracts versus descending tracts. When we talked about ascending versus descending, they have different kinds of neurons in them. So let me list our names over here. First order, second order, third order, upper motor, and lower motor. By the way, help me out. Do I have anybody that likes Star Wars that's here today? I feel like one of these rings a bell, like it's Star Wars something related. Are one of these related to Star Wars, or am I totally wrong? What's the order in Star Wars, the most recent ones? First order? Okay. Because I was going to say, man, reading one of these is tripping some bell in my mind, but it's been so long. It's been a crazy couple of years on my end. So it's like, I know I've seen a movie with Star Wars that had something like this. So apparently the First Order is in Star Wars. That sounds right. I'll go ask my husband and he'll totally know because like he's a Star Wars nerd. So first order neurons, second order neurons, third order neurons. All of these are found in which kind of tract? Ascending tracts or descending tracts? Where do these three live? First order, second order, third order. Yes. All of these are the ones in my ascending tracts. Ascending tracts. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. You should never tell me that there is a first order neuron in a descending tract. You should never tell me there's a second order neuron in a descending tract. You should never tell me there's a third order neuron in a descending tract. They're not there. I only find them in ascending tracts, which means these types of neurons only ever do sensory information. My ascending tracts take sensory information from the body up to the brain. These are the neurons that are involved in that process. We also have these upper motor and lower motor neurons, which their name gives away for me, right? That they're in the motor tracts. So the motor tracts are the descending tracts. When we talk about an upper motor neuron compared to a lower motor neuron, we are talking about where the tract starts and where the tract ends. So your lower motor neurons are always going to be the ones that go out to the muscle tissue, that synapse with the muscle tissue. The upper motor neurons are always going to be the ones that start in the brain or the brain stem or the cerebellum, somewhere up higher. So make sure we know about the types of neurons in a descending tract and the types of neurons in an ascending tract. They are different, just like the functions of these tracts are different. We talked about a few examples of different tracts. Let me make sure that I clarify for you so you guys know. On the exam, I am not going to ask you which specific kind of sensory information does the lateral spinothalamic tract carry. I'm not going to ask that. I'm not going to ask you, exam, which specific kind of sensory information does the anterior spinothalamic tract carry? I don't care that you know that. That's not for the sake of our anatomy class. What I care that you know is this tract ascending or descending? Where does it start? Where does it end? Big picture, what kind of information does it send? So let's use this picture and use the name of this tract to figure these things out. This is called the Spinothalamic tract. Let's start with that spinal part. We did this in office hours before. Spino. When I see that beginning part, what is that referring to? Spino. Promise it's not a trick question. Yeah, it means it starts somewhere related to the spine, right? Specifically, it means we're starting in the spinal cord. Spinal cord. The first part of my name is Spino. Spino means spinal cord. It's related to that spinal cord. Second part of my name is thalamic. Thalamic means that I go to the, yeah, a couple of us are chiming in here. Thalamic means I go up to the part of the brain called the thalamus. Here is a cumulative final exam review for us here. The thalamus is a structure that's found in the middle of the cerebrum. I can see it up here. When I talk about the thalamus we said was something that sorted information, or it was my relay center. So I send information up to the thalamus to make sure it gets to the right part in my cerebrum. Okay, check this out. My name means spinal cord to the thalamus. The spinal cord is literally below the thalamus. Information is going up. Based on the name of this tract, spinothalamic, would we say this is an ascending tract or a descending tract? Spinothalamic, ascending or descending? Yeah, this is an ascending tract. I promise you it's not a trick question. If we start in the spinal cord and we go up to the brain, that's an ascending tract. So what I want you to know with the name of this tract here is that this is an ascending tract, which takes all that information with it then, right? The stuff we outlined before. That means this is a sensory tract. That means that we have 3 neurons here. We've got our first order neuron in red, our second order neuron in yellow, and our third order neuron in blue. So ascending tracts, almost all of them, to be frank with you, almost all of them start with spino. I think they all do, actually. So you see spino, and we know that we're starting in the spinal cord. We can literally only go up from the spinal cord. So spinothalamic, an ascending tract that starts in the spinal cord, goes to the thalamus, spinothalamic. Eileen asked about the second example we did that has spino in it. Spino means spinal cord. Cerebellar, right here. What does this cerebellar word mean? Again, I promise not a trick question. Cerebellar, what's that going to mean? Yeah, I'm making you type a long word, aren't I? That's a long one to type. Cerebellar means that we're going to cerebellum. The spinocerebellar tract, we still start in the spinal cord. We go to the cerebellum. We're still going from a lower structure to a higher structure. But where this one ends is the cerebellum. It does not end in the thalamus. It does not end in the cerebrum somewhere. When I talk about the spinocerebellar tract, Eileen is correct that this one actually only has 2 neurons in it. This is a special case here with the tracts. The spinocerebellar tract only has 2 neurons in it. Because see, here's something that we didn't discuss today that your guided lesson talks about. The second order neuron, the one that's in the middle of an ascending tract, this one starts in the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. This is where it starts. Who can tell me where the second order neuron usually ends? Does anyone remember from their notes? Where does the second order neuron usually end? Usually ends, yes, Ariel's right, in the thalamus, usually. Because see, that third order neuron starts in the thalamus and ends in, usually, oops, the postcentral gyrus. Let me make sure I can get that word to fit. Postcentral gyrus. Usually that second order neuron goes to the thalamus, except in this particular tract right here, spinocerebellar, I go to the cerebellum. I do not go to the thalamus. So I don't have a place to meet that third order neuron because that third order neuron lives in the thalamus. So I only have a first order neuron that I see here in blue and a second order neuron that I see here in red. I promise you guys, I swear, that I'm not going to be tricky on the exam and ask you about the third order neuron in the spinocerebellar tract. You guys know that I sometimes am a mean teacher, right? I ask you some hard questions. That's just a stupid question. I'm not going to ask you that. But I would ask you, is this an ascending tract or a descending tract? I would ask you, where does this start and where does it end? I would ask you to make a prediction about whether this could carry sensory information or motor information. That's the kind of things that I would ask you about this. I'm not going to be super specific and ask you a trick question about a third order neuron. So 2 tracts that we talked about so far, spinothalamic, spinocerebellar. The other tract that we talked about, actually we talked about 2 other tracts, are the corticospinal tract and the vestibulospinal tract. Hey, spinal still means the same thing. It still means the spinal cord. So this time with putting spinal in the end, that tells me that I end in the spinal cord. Who remembers from office hours what this cortico part right here meant? What did cortico mean? Does anyone remember? That's kind of a weird. Yeah, a couple of us chiming in here. This word cortico means the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex. And yeah, just like our last comment there, that is the outside part of the brain. Absolutely. So the outside part of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. That's where this tract starts. It starts in the cerebral cortex and it goes to the spinal cord. We're going from the brain to the spinal cord. Does that make this ascending or descending? From the brain to the spinal cord. Ascending or descending? Yeah, we're descending. Literally, its name tells me that. We're going down from a higher structure to a lower structure. So in a descending tract, now we have 2 neurons. The first one starts up here. So here's a wink, wink, nudge, nudge reminder. The place in the cerebral cortex where it's going to start is the precentral gyrus. This was the one that was the motor one, the precentral gyrus. Sends its information down through the brainstem. So here's the first part of the brainstem, second part of the brainstem, third part of the brainstem, all the way down into the spinal cord, where it's going to synapse with the lower motor neuron, right there, lower motor neuron. I only have 2 neurons in this tract because it is a descending tract. Starts in the brain, cortico, down to the spinal cord, spinal. We also talked about this one, but hey, hopefully after starting to work on special senses, this beginning part isn't quite as scary for us. Vestibulo means the vestibule, and the vestibule was the part of your inner ear that does balance. Now that we've done special senses, maybe this one makes more sense for us. Vestibulo, that refers to the vestibule, your balance part of your ear, and spinal still refers to the spinal cord. Now, this is not the cerebrum, right? We can't see the nice gray matter on the outside, the nice white matter on the middle. We're in the brainstem here. But it doesn't matter if you can tell exactly where we are in the brainstem, which you can't, right? I can't even necessarily tell. But what I can tell is that I'm starting somewhere and going down into the spinal cord. The spinal cord is down lower. So I start in the brainstem, right about here, go down into the spinal cord. This is another example of a descending tract. So descending tracts carry motor information. We have upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. With our descending tract, there was one other kind of terminology we needed to know. Direct motor pathways versus indirect motor pathways. This has to do with where the upper motor neuron lives. So a lot of us are chiming in correctly that this one, vestibulospinal, is an example of an indirect motor pathway. And an indirect motor pathway, I do not start in the cerebrum. I do not start in the cerebrum. So I'm going to start somewhere in the brainstem, like the midbrain or the pons or the medulla oblongata. A direct motor pathway starts in the cerebrum. So when we talked about the corticospinal pathway, that would be an example of a direct motor pathway. It starts in the cerebrum. When we talk about vestibulospinal, we're talking about an indirect motor pathway because it started in the brainstem, not the cerebral cortex. Eileen asked, doesn't it start in cranial 8? So the sensory information that we use in this tract, the balance information, is collected by cranial nerve number 8. Yes, it's brought back into the brainstem, where the brainstem then starts to process it. Because remember, cranial nerve number 8 collects sensory information. And when we're talking about these tracts, especially a descending tract, that's actually all motor. So it's starting very near to the same place that cranial nerve number 8 would come in. There's these little, let me see if it's labeled on my picture here. Yeah, so it's kind of labeled on my picture here. There's these things, if you remember when we were talking about the brain, we talked about nuclei, the basal nuclei. That was gray matter in the middle of the white matter in a place. So cranial nerve 8 brings in its sensory information and synapses out here. And then I have some motor neurons that live here inside this nucleus, specifically my upper motor neuron for the vestibulospinal tract. It gets the sensory information from cranial nerve number 8 and translates that into, here's the motor response that we need to have. So it is definitely related to cranial nerve number 8 for sure. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so for tracts, just like for reflexes, I am promising you that I'm going to give you the name of a tract that we didn't talk about, but I'm also promising you that you will have the information you need with figuring out where that spinal part is in its name. Is it at the beginning or is it at the end? That will help you to know, is this ascending or descending? Once you figure out if it's ascending or descending, you can figure out, is it sensory or is it motor? When you know that kind of information, you can tell me if it has first order neurons or upper motor neurons or what it has in it. So again, don't lose your head when you see a new tract you've never heard of before. Break down its name. Is it starting with spino or is it ending with spinal? That's your biggest tip off for those tracts. Yeah, so the question is, if spinal is in the second part of its name, does that mean it's descending? Yes, that is correct. If it ends with spinal, that means it's a descending tract because we're always going down to the spinal cord. regardless of what's in front of spinal, whether it's something related to the brain, whether it's something related to the brain stem. If I end up in the spinal cord, that's always descending. That's correct. Any other questions? Or give me a thumbs up. Yeah, you say, Eileen's saying, I hope I can do this. I know you can do this. I promise it's not, it sounds intimidating until you sit down and you look at it and you just pause for a second and breathe. I know you guys have the skills to do it. It's not as hard as it sounds like it is. I promise. How do we tell if the ascending or descending tract is sensory? Let me put that question to the class. The question, so we can see it there with Ashley. She said, how do we tell if an ascending or descending tract is a sensory tract? Can anyone help me out with that? Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that we're chiming in here. Yep. First way is we can just straight up memorize it. An ascending tract is always sensory. A descending tract is always motor. The second way that we can work on it, though, is to consider the direction information is going. There's nothing up here in my brain that, there's no muscles up here for me to control. The only place in my body where there's muscles are down below my brain. So I would only ever send motor information from the top down. The kind of information I send to my brain is what I need to process. And so what I need to process is sensory information that needs to go up. So we can think through it or we can memorize it. Either way would definitely work for that one. Yeah, so the question is, the order is recognize the tract, then recognize if it's motor, and then recognize the function. Honestly, Ashley, I'm not going to ask you specific functions on the tracts. The big thing I'm going to ask you to do is tell me if it's sensory or motor based on its name. Tell me about the neurons that it has in it, again, based on its name. So knowing that it has first order, second order, third order, or knowing that it has upper and lower motor neurons. So I'm not going to ask you specific functions on these tracts. All right. Those were our two topics that we mentioned we wanted to talk about in lesson number 12. I'm going to start doing some work in lesson number 13. We'll see what we get through today. And then we'll do more lesson number 13 work tomorrow during office hours. So if I don't hit the question that you had for lesson number 13, try to make it tomorrow or try to watch that recording. I'll get it posted for you as soon as possible since that homework is due tomorrow night. So let me pull up lesson number 13. Here, I know I have some friends who weren't able to make it to this lesson, so let me pop up. I was particularly proud of this meme right here. Some of my friends who were here for office hours with me, we enjoyed this one. This was a pretty good one right here. Yeah, Eileen says she can taste red. We talked about that. Being able to taste visual sensations, seeing noises. I'm just saying, I am looking forward to after I've had my baby and I can have as much coffee as I want. Granted, that will keep him awake too when he's breastfeeding, but there's some prices I'm willing to pay, I guess. So we joked that, because I'm pretty sure when I put up this meme was right around the time of when the lab exam was going live. So we said to brew your coffee extra strong for when you take that lab exam, and maybe you can see noises. So normally we should not be seeing noises, right? That's not ideal. So just a fun little guy here. Okay. Yeah, we're tasting colors or seeing noises, or even hearing noises in the middle of the night is probably not great. Okay, so quick reminder, I'm not gonna hit this very hard. because I know that I did this in office hours, and you guys can look that up. But just a reminder for you that when we talk about the types of sensory information in the body, we've got general sensory information, and we have special sensory information. And lesson number 13 is all about that special sensory information. There are 5 kinds of special sensory information. What are those 5 kinds of special sensory information that we collect? Let's see if we can shoot them out there in the chat. What are some of those types of special information? Vision. Yep, special senses starts with vision. Okay, we got balance. We got taste, hearing. Yep, and somebody sent me in smell too. Yep, we got them all. There's my special senses. Everything else, literally everything else that you detect besides these things, everything else you detect is general sensory information. General sensory information is the stuff that goes through the spinal cord using those ascending tracts. So some of that stuff, like we talked about, that's pressure when you step on that Lego. That's temperature when you touch that hot burner. That's pain if those things get too intense. Yep, that can be stretching. Again, like I said, anything that's not one of my special senses that I see right here, there's just 5 special senses. So when you're doing the homework, if you see something that's not one of these 5 special senses, it is automatically a general sense. So I do ask you to do a little compare and contrast. The other thing we want to compare and contrast with special senses versus general senses is where they send their information to in the brain. All of my general sensory information in the body actually goes to the same place in the brain. Remember back in Unit 3 when we talked about that funky map, the sensory homunculus, where different parts of your body were different sizes. The reason they were different sizes is some parts of your body collect a lot of this kind of information, and some parts of your body don't collect very much of this information at all. So the sensory homunculus lives here on, hey, remind me, what's the name of the bump for the sensory homunculus? It's a gyrus. Yeah, it's the one on the back side, right? The post-central gyrus, the backside bump. That's where all of this general sensory information goes, where I've got that map, the sensory homunculus back here. When we talk about special sensory information, that information each has its own place inside the brain. So when we're talking about olfactory information, what's the easy word for the kind of information olfactory is? Olfactory is the anatomy word, right? Yeah, so the easy word for olfactory is smell. So all of your smell information ends up here in the temporal lobe of the brain, right next to that hearing information that goes to the auditory area in the brain. What's the name of this lobe back here that helps me out with vision? What lobe is back here that helps me with vision? Who lives in the back? Yes, that's the occipital lobe, here in the back, exactly. Gustatory information we talked about, we're relying a bit on lab to remind us where gustatory information goes. Who remembers the name of the special lobe that gustatory information goes to? Yeah, so gustatory information, what I don't like about my picture is that it doesn't show well that this goes to the insula. The insula, that's the deep lobe, the one that hides underneath all the other lobes of the brain. So gustatory information way down inside. The other information that's going to be down a little bit deeper, not, aka we discussed this in office hours, balance information does not go to the sensory homunculus. I know my picture is bad and looks like it. We discussed how I can't tell you exactly where it goes, but I can tell you it does not go to the sensory homunculus. So my balance information also has a special place to go to. It's possible that it's also in the insula, but I need to do a little more digging on that. But remember, we were honest. I told you that is one that I'm not going to ask you about on the exam. I will ask you potentially about my other ones. So make sure we know the lobes, where my other ones go. Or make sure we know too that that general sensory information goes to that post-central gyrus. All that goes to that bump that I have right here. So big idea here, special sensory information has its own special place in the brain to be processed. General sensory information is all processed in the same general location, and that's that post-central gyrus. We had the question about cranial nerves and the special senses. So so the question is, hearing occurs in the temporal lobe. Let me put that to the class. Hearing in the temporal lobe, yes or no? Yes. Yep. Hearing in the temporal lobe along with smell in the temporal lobe there. Yeah. All right. We need to know for each of the special senses which cranial nerves assist with that special sense. So I lost my list from before. Let me see if I can remember it generally in the order we talked about. Vision, taste, smell, balance. What am I missing? Vision, taste, smell, balance. Hearing, thank you. That was a pregnancy brain moment for real. No joke there. I was like, I know there's another one, so help me. Okay, so with the cranial nerves, we are, what we talked about with outlining what cranial nerves do what is to reference your lab packet. So the lab packet about the cranial nerves, let's go through and we'll use the kinds of information that was in that packet to help us outline these. Let's start up here. We'll do our first one together here. Cranial nerve number 1, called the olfactory nerve. This one does help me with special senses. Which special sense does this one help with? Yeah, this is a special sense of smell. So here next to smell, the word you're going to see on the exam and on the homework, the technical name for smell is olfaction. You're going to see me use that word olfaction. It's a technical name for it. So that helps me out when I'm trying to figure out my cranial nerve that does smell. The olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 1. Put little arrows here. That's my cranial nerve that helps me with olfaction. Its name is olfactory. It helps me with olfaction. Cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 2 also helps me with a special sense. The optic nerve helps me with the special sense of, yes, some of us are chiming in, optic nerve helps me with a special sense of vision. So the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, that one helps me with vision. When we talk about cranial nerve number 3, and where'd it go? Number 4 and number 6. These ones do not help me with a special sense, but they all have the same function. 3, 4, and 6. Does anyone remember what these cranial nerves do? Yeah, so several of us are chiming in here. We can use the name of number 3 to help me predict it. Oculomotor. Oculo means eyes. Motor means movement. Cranial nerves number 3, 4, and 6 all do movement of the eyeball. So we would say that these cranial nerves are not directly involved in the process of vision. They're not detecting light waves. They're not picking up that kind of information. They help me to move the eyeball. The only one that actually helps me to see is cranial nerve number 2, the optic nerve. Let's go down to cranial nerve number 8. Cranial nerve number 8 is called the vestibulocochlear nerve. The vestibulocochlear nerve helps me with 2 of my special senses. Yeah, so when we look at its name, I can figure out those two parts. This cochlear part means that it's collecting information from the cochlea, which is the hearing part. So let's put its name, vestibulo, and I'm going to make highlight here, cochlear nerve. That's number 8. And then the vestibulo part of its name is the balance part. Number 8. 2 special senses that the vestibulocochlear nerve is involved in. Helping me with balance, that's that vestibulo part of the nerve, and the cochlear part of the nerve, which is the hearing part. So that leaves me the special sense of taste. And the special sense of taste is actually done by 2 different cranial nerves. The 2 different cranial nerves that are involved in taste collect taste information from different parts of the tongue. So my first cranial nerve, yeah, and so Eileen chimed in for us here to help us out. The first cranial nerve that assists with the process of taste is the facial nerve. So we'll add the facial nerve to our list over here on taste. Facial nerve. Facial nerve is number 7. The facial nerve collects information from the front part of your tongue, and like its name suggests, it collects information from your face. So your face and the front part of your tongue. Taste information specifically is that branch that goes to the tongue. The other nerve that helps us out with taste is called the glossopharyngeal. Pharyngeal. See if I can spell that one. That one is cranial nerve number 9. Oh, that number went away. We'll put it down here so you can see it. Number 9. I put in caps this glosso part because the glosso part of its name means tongue. So the glossopharyngeal nerve, the one right here, glossopharyngeal nerve also collects sensory information from the tongue, helping you out with the sense of taste. So 2 cranial nerves that do taste, number 7 and number 9. Cranial nerve number 8 does hearing and balance. Cranial nerve number 1 does olfaction, just like its name suggests, and number 2 helps us with vision. So do make sure we know for our cranial nerves what special sensory information they collect. And I'll mention for you, I believe in one of the videos that I had you guys watching, Crash Course, I think that he mentioned another nerve that helps out with taste. I am not holding you responsible for that other nerve. So what I want you to know is 7 and 9. Make sure we know that 7 and 9 are our taste sensations. And yeah, there was a question about glossopharyngeal being the back of the tongue. That's correct. Its name technically means tongue throat. That's what glossopharyngeal means. The pharynx is the upper part of the throat. So glossopharyngeal, tongue, throat. We do actually do some tasting in our throat, not a lot, but a little bit of tasting in our throat too. Mostly that taste information comes from the first part, the glosso part. Thumbs up or other questions about cranial nerves? Is that why the taste buds are on the back of the tongue? Eileen asks. There are actually taste buds all over the tongue, but there are those really big ones on the back of the tongue. So yeah, those really big ones would feed into the glossopharyngeal nerves. So they're called the valate papillae, the big bumps on the back. They would definitely be sending their information to the glossopharyngeal nerve for sure. Good connection to make. Most of those ones that cover the tongue are the fungiform ones. The fungiform papillae with taste buds inside of them, they're going to send their information through the facial nerve, Okay. Yeah, the fungiform papillae are found all over the tongue. Yep, everywhere except the very back where I have those valate papillae back there. Fungiform are what we have the most of. I got several questions about the different types of structures of the eyeball, specifically accessory structures compared to visual structures. With the number of questions I got, I do need to go back and check and make sure the homework is keyed correctly. We'll go through and talk about it, and then I'll try to check this afternoon to make sure that we're not having some issues with it. Let's make sure, though, today that we understand concepts, and I promise I will check that key after class today to make sure it's correct. In the chat, help me out. When we are talking about the eyeball, what is the difference, or maybe what's the function of a visual structure compared to what the function of an accessory structure might be? What's the difference between a visual structure and an accessory structure of the eyeball? Let's start with that. What do visual structures do? I know I'm making you type a lot, so I'll be patient. Yeah. So when we talk about visual structures, yeah, I like how we had some talk of directly interacting with light or directly involved in vision. The best way to describe visual structures will say interact with light waves. And the best way to describe what a visual structure does when it interacts with light waves, either that's going to mean that it bends them in some way, that's going to mean that it detects them in some way, that might mean that it's a passageway for them to enter the eyeball. These are the kind of things when we talk about a visual structure, they're somehow directly involved in the process of vision. We also have a lot of things that are called accessory structures. And really the accessory structures are more about the eyeball itself. So we'll say accessory structures give, well, here, let's make a list because there's a few things we can say. Yeah, so Eileen mentioned that it keeps eyeball healthy. It also, we could say, gives the eyeball its shape. We could say that this moves the eyeball. Since we didn't do special senses in lab, we didn't talk a lot about these guys. But there's a bunch of muscles that live on the outside of the eyeball, like this one we see here, the lateral rectus. Here on the other side, chopped off, would be the medial rectus. There's a bunch of muscles that live on the outside of the eyeball that move the eyeball. Those would be considered accessory structures because they don't touch the light, but they do help to move the eyeball. They're attached to the eyeball. So when we're talking about visual structures compared to accessory structures, the big thing to keep in mind is, do they directly do something to the light? That's the best way to think about it. Are they directly involved in the light? That might be most helpful. So let me go to this picture here that you guys have to label in your notes, because this would be a good time for us to practice labeling and then deciding if things are accessory or visual structures. So let's start with a structure that we already talked about because we mentioned it with our reflexes here. This front part of my eyeball right here, what is this front part of the eyeball right here called? The very front clear part of your eye. Yep, that is the part of our eye known as the cornea. The cornea is the part of the eyeball that actually bends light the most. So the cornea bends light. With it bending light, then, that means that this is definitely a visual structure. The cornea is definitely a visual structure. When the cornea bends the light, its goal is to get the light through the hole that's right here. The hole that's right here, that is the opening in your eye where light goes to. What is the name of the black opening in the middle of your eye? Yep, the black opening in the middle is called the pupil. Light passes directly through here. We're going to consider the pupil another visual structure. Light goes straight through it. Back behind, yep, so like she mentioned here for me, back behind it, we have the lens. The lens is the other structure that's very strongly involved in bending light. This is another visual structure. The goal of the lens is to get that light bent and focused on the yellow layer back here that I'm now coloring black. What's the name of this yellow layer back here where light has to go? Yes, yeah, lots of us chiming in on here. The yellow layer in the very back of the eyeball is the retina. And I hope there's no question in your mind that the retina is the most important visual structure. Remember with the vision disorders that if I don't focus my light waves on this retina, I'm not going to be able to detect them. I have to focus everything at one point on the retina to be able to detect it. Now, the retina is made of two types of cells. Yep, there come those cells names for us here in the chat. The two types of cells are called the rods and the cones. And these are the cells that literally detect the light. So again, they are visual structures. They literally detect the light. The process of detecting light requires energy. So if I need energy to detect light, I need to have oxygen and nutrients. Nutrients to break down into energy, oxygen to help my cell function. This layer that's shown in blue, I'm going to color on it back here. Yeah, this layer that's shown in blue here, name of this layer is called the choroid. Choroid. The job of the choroid is to bring blood supply to the retina, to the eyeball itself. However, bringing blood does not mean that I interact with light waves. This is my first example of an accessory structure. It's my first example of an accessory structure. It keeps the rods and the cones healthy. It's the blood supply, so this blue layer in here that's right next to the retina, that's the blood supply for the retina. It's an accessory structure. It keeps them functional, gives them what they need. The outer layer that in this picture is kind of pink, on your eyes, it's white usually, although we were talking about how we're kind of bloodshot right now, right? What's the normally white part of your eyeball called? Yeah, the white part of the eyeball, what's supposed to be white, right, is the sclera. Sclera. The job of the sclera is to be an attachment site for muscles, and it's also to give the eyeball its overall circle shape. Neither of those things are interacting with light waves. This is another accessory structure. Accessory structure. I didn't really ask you guys to identify it, but I'll just mention, here's one of those muscles that we talked about, another muscle down here. Those would be other examples of accessory structures. When we talk about, yeah, so actually, Kathleen, it's different than, these are not the ciliary muscles. These ones I just circled out here, I didn't actually give you their names before. I'll give you their name just to toss it out there. They're called extrinsic eyeball muscles. Extrinsic. That means they're on the outside. Yes, so the sclera is an accessory structure, so is the extrinsic eyeball muscles, the ones on the outside. These ones right here are the ones that Kathleen mentioned. These ones right here are what we call the ciliary muscles. The ciliary muscles. What's the job of the ciliary muscles? What do the ciliary muscles do? Yeah, so their job has to do with what they're attached to. Their job has to do with the lens, changing the shape of the lens. So because these ciliary muscles directly change the shape of the lens, which is bending light, I would probably classify these ciliary muscles as another visual structure, simply because their job is to make sure that this structure is in the right shape so that it can bend the light. Yes, exactly. By expanding and contracting, these muscles expand and contract and change the shape of the lens, which allows us to get the light waves focused in the right place. So I would call the ciliary muscles a visual structure. They're changing the shape of the lens, which is directly involved in focusing the light. The other structure for us to mention is the colored part of the eye. What's the name of the colored part of your eye? Colored part. Yeah, the colored part of the eye is called the iris. Iris. And in the very middle of the iris is that thing called the pupil, the open space that light waves pass through. The iris expands and contracts to change the size of the pupil. Because the pupil is a structure that light passes through, I would also say that the iris is a visual structure as well. A visual structure. Because it expands and contracts to change the size of the pupil, the thing here in the very middle. I am going to check, like I said, this afternoon, I'm going to go and check those questions on the homework about the visual and the accessory structures to help you guys out with that, because I know I got several questions about that. Use this as your study guide here, and be thinking about just kind of in general the differences in the function of an accessory structure versus a visual structure, especially when we're talking about stuff that's on the outside of the eyeball. Stuff on the outside of the eyeball is not going to be a visual structure. Now, the exception to that would be this thing right here. Who can tell me what this is right here that I'm looking at in yellow? Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, this is the optic nerve. This down here is my optic nerve. And it should come as no surprise to us here that the optic nerve would also be considered a visual structure. Because this is where I send vision information when it leaves the eyeball, out through the optic nerve. So the one exception to the rule of if you live outside the eyeball, you're an accessory structure, would be this guy right here. Because without this, we definitely cannot see. So visual structures and accessory structures. I will not ask you to identify the structures on pictures, since that's more of a lab thing. But a good way for you to study and review them is to go through in terms of accessory versus visual and go through and label them. We have a little bit of time left. We had a request for vision disorders. So what all, really fast, let me pop up this picture right here. This is kind of underline, highlight, star, must know, big picture of vision. This is how vision has to work. For you to be able to see things, what is the name of the structure in the eyeball that light waves have to focus on for you to be able to see them? Where do those light waves have to focus for you to see? Exactly. Okay, so I'll put it all in caps here. For you to be able to see something, the light waves, waves plural, must focus on the retina. That is an underline, highlight, star. We got to know that because that's how the whole process of vision works. That's why we can have vision disorders, because we have problems with getting the light waves to focus on the retina. Remember that when you're seeing things normally, so right now you're looking at your computer, and in a couple of minutes someone comes in and you look up and you see them in the doorway. We look at things up close, we look at things that are far away, and our ability to see both of those things clearly is because we change the direction of the light waves. So we always must end up on the retina. If we don't end up on the retina, we can't see clearly. So that's the basis of our vision disorders when we start to look at them. First vision disorder was myopia. When we talk about myopia, the eyeball is too long. So the eyeball has stretched out. When we talk about people who have myopia, can they see things up close or things that are far away? Myopia, yes, myopia is we can see things, oop, I'm still in caps lock, see things close. So the easy person name for myopia is nearsightedness. Nearsightedness. Myopia means I can see things close. I can't see them far away. Because the problem is when things come in from far away and I try to focus them, my retina is back farther than I expect it to be. My cornea and my lens, they focus it where the retina should normally be, except the retina is back farther. Therefore, I can't see what I'm trying to see. It's very blurry. Contrast with hyperopia. In hyperopia, we have the opposite problem now. The eyeball is too short. So it's not round like it should be. It's shorter, which means that when I bring in light waves, I bend them with my cornea and my lens, I bend them and try to send them to where the retina normally would be. The retina is not there because we're back in the adipose tissue of the eyeball here. So like someone mentioned in the chat for me, when we're talking about hyperopia, I can see things that are far away. So this one, in easy person words, is farsightedness. Farsightedness. Nearsightedness, myopia. Farsightedness, hyperopia. In both of these conditions, what is the same about them? What is big picture? What's wrong in both of the conditions? Do you remember? Yes, so the biggest picture, light doesn't focus on the retina. Yeah, so in these two particular conditions, it comes down to the shape of the eyeball. Yeah, so you were totally right though. So biggest picture, big picture problem. And this is the problem actually with every single vision disorder. Light not on retina. Biggest picture. Oop, I spelled it wrong. Sorry. Biggest picture. More specifically though, with myopia and hyperopia, we'll call this just big picture. Big picture. This is an issue with eyeball shape. Eyeball shape. In myopia, the eyeball's too long. In hyperopia, the eyeball is too short. Biggest picture, and again, this is every single vision disorder. Biggest picture, light's not getting to the retina. Well, why isn't light getting to the retina? In the case of these two disorders, myopia and hyperopia, it's because the eyeball has the wrong shape. So, first two vision disorders, problems with eyeball shape. Then we talked about presbyopia. Presbyopia. When we talked about presbyopia, can you see things up close or things that are far away? Presbyopia, who can see, yes, far. We can see far. When we talked about presbyopia, who develops or who has presbyopia? Does anyone remember? Is this something you're born with or something, yep, as we start aging, right? So we can see far, and I'm going to put in parentheses here, can't see close. And the way that I like to refer to it, we said this in office hours last week, age-related farsightedness. Age-related farsightedness. Because this develops with aging. So like somebody put in the chat for me, 35 to 50, that is right about when we start to see this happening. Yeah, Letty's like, I'm there. It's only a matter of time for me, man. I'm sure it's coming for me too. So age-related farsightedness. As we age, we start to have the same kind of problems as we did in hyperopia. Remember with hyperopia that we tried to focus the vision, the visual information, behind the retina, in a place where the retina is not there anymore. But it's not because the shape of the eyeball is wrong. What is giving me trouble in presbyopia? What causes presbyopia? It's not the eyeball shape. Yeah, so Yeah, I like the idea of calling this a problem. Big picture. This is a problem with changing the lens shape. Changing the lens shape. Because there's two problems here. Problem number one, like somebody said in the chat for me, the lens is hard. If the lens is hard, it's going to be hard for me to change its shape. It's going to take a lot of work. It's supposed to be squishy and flexible, and that's how you go from seeing things close to far. When you have presbyopia, it starts to get harder, so it's not as flexible as it used to be. And let's couple that with the fact, like somebody else said for me in the chat, that the ciliary muscles get weak. The things that were supposed to pull on the lens now would have to work harder anyway because the lens is hard. On top of that, those muscles are getting old and tired. So my muscles that change the shape of the lens aren't as strong as they used to be, and the lens has gotten harder. Because of that, I can't change it. And what that ends up giving me trouble with is seeing things that are up close. To help me get things that are up close into the right place of the retina, I need to take that lens and let's go back to our picture here. When I want to see something that's up close, remember the way I described my lens right here? We said my lens was short and stout. I got to squeeze it down. Well, if my lens is hard for me to squeeze it short and stout, it wants to be long and skinny. It wants to stay that way. So as the lens gets harder, as the muscles get weaker, I can't make my lens go short and stout anymore, which means I can't see things that are up close. So presbyopia, an issue with the lens and an issue with those muscles. It's the same deal as what we saw with hyperopia in terms of I can't focus the light in the right place, which is also, as an aside, a problem with myopia. But the reason I can't do this as I get older is because of these muscles that got weak and because of the lens that got hard. The question is, would it be possible for children to have this if they have undeveloped muscle tone for the ciliary muscles? Possibly. I don't know how common that is in children. I think it's more of an issue in children that are experiencing farsightedness. It really is more an issue of the shape of the eyeball, typically with children. So very young children who are wearing glasses, it probably has more to do with the shape of their eyeball as opposed to the ciliary muscles. But it is possible potentially that it could be an issue with the ciliary muscles. Yeah. If we could figure out a way to strengthen those muscles, then possibly, yeah. I think in general though, and just full disclosure for assignments and tests, when I talk about it in children, we're talking about hyperopia. We're not talking about presbyopia. So just the heads up for me. I'm not totally familiar with that science, but it absolutely could be correct that if we strengthen those ciliary muscles, maybe that would alleviate that. 2 minutes, one last vision disorder. Help me out here. Our last vision disorder is astigmatism. What is the problem in astigmatism? What's happening in astigmatism? Yeah, so my cornea is the wrong shape. And if the cornea is the wrong shape, what's going on with my vision? Yeah, there we go. A couple answers coming in with this part right here. Multiple focal points. We need all of our light waves to hit the retina at the same place. If they don't hit the retina at the same place, or if you look at our picture here, let me zoom in a little bit, especially if neither of those places that we're hitting is actually the retina, if neither of those places that I'm hitting is the retina, then I definitely can't see clearly. I need all of my light waves to focus on the retina at one point. If I can't focus them at one point on the retina, I cannot see clearly. And if I focus them at places that aren't even on the retina, that's like my other vision disorders. I can't see clearly. So when we talk about astigmatism, that comes down to the cornea being the wrong shape. But remember, with each of my vision disorders, we'll go back to what's on the very first one. Biggest picture. biggest picture problem with every single one of these vision disorders, light waves don't focus on the, fill in the blank for me. Biggest picture with all of these vision disorders is that the light waves are not focusing on the retina. Yep, biggest picture. Light waves are not focusing on the retina. So that applies to every single vision disorder we talked about. We're not focusing those light waves on the retina. We have a whole slew of different reasons that we're not focusing it there. Sometimes we're focusing it behind the eyeball. Sometimes we're focusing it in front of the eyeball. Sometimes we're focusing it in multiple places. So biggest picture, it all comes down to the retina. Find your similarities and your differences as you're going through and comparing the disorders. So hyperopia and presbyopia, we would correct with the same shape of lens, yes. I mentioned in office hours last week, though, I'm not going to be so specific on the exam to ask you convex versus concave, but you would want to know that, yes, I could use the same kinds of lenses to correct hyperopia and presbyopia because they're both the same problem. Okay, so things we did not cover today. We wanted to talk a little bit more about hearing and balance. 100% I will start with that tomorrow morning. If you have other specific questions related to anything from the spinal cord or anything else from special senses, please bring those tomorrow. I'm going to do some looking on the homework assignment for accessory versus visual structures to try to help you out with that. But yeah, bring your questions tomorrow, and remember that exam is open for you. Please plan to take it either today or tomorrow. Don't wait till Wednesday because internet is notoriously dicey right now. So I'm going to say goodbye to my friends on the recording and stick around for a bit. So for my recorded friends, see you later.